Ladies and gentlemen, this is Watson Michael from Ceylon Institute of English and Leadership. And once again, we're honored to have Mr. Sean Kidney back with us. So Sean, he is the Chief Executive Officer of Climate Bonds Initiative, Professor in Practice, SOAS, University London, member of the European Union Platform on Sustainable Finance, member Finance Industry Advisory Board of the International Energy Agency, and several other boards. Sean, welcome back. How are you doing?
Hey, Michael, thanks for having me. Fun to be here.
Yeah, great. All right. So these days, Sean, so many things happening, right, on the road to net zero. And last year was the hottest year on records. So
yep.
Welcome
to the future.
Yeah.
And by the way, there's a good chance this year will be the hottest year on record. And there's a good chance that next year will then again be the hottest year on record, because things are changing fast now. You know, the G20 about 16 months ago officially said 1.5 degrees warming needs to be the maximum temperature we allow the world to get to.
Yeah.
However, the World Meteorological Organization said last year we're going to get there in the next couple of years, certainly by 2027 at the latest. In other words, we are failing on a monumental scale. And the way that failing plays out for ordinary people is going to be much hotter weather. And that doesn't just mean in Finland and Siberia, where they've had 30 degrees Celsius temperatures and bushfires the last few years. It also means in Sri Lanka and Singapore and Southwest USA and Ecuador. It means water is going to go crazy, more monsoonal in some places. Do you know that in Boston, in the USA, they are widening the stormwater drains because rainfall is becoming monsoonal in Boston? This is just crazy. Volatility is going to be the theme of the 21st century if you compare it to the 20th century. We're going to get crazy weather. You're probably going to see hailstones in Colombo. You're going to see, well, we've seen already snow in southern Brazil. They don't get snow. They had snow last year. So it's not just going to be all hot. It's just going to be crazy weather of all sorts. But one thing that is certain, storms will be way more intense going forward than they are now. And the flow-on effect of all of this sort of stuff. Storms, by the way, means storm surges as well. That means washing over the water in the beach in Arugan Bay, where I remember going all those years ago on holidays in eastern Sri Lanka, and destroying the town. And we get to recover from that. So our societies and our economies are going to be under stress. We're going to be constantly having to recover from the last and infuriating crisis that we've had. It's going to become the norm, and we need to prepare. We need to be thinking now really strongly, globally, about what it's like to survive in a different world. Because now there is no doubt whatsoever that climate change is going to get more serious for the next 30 years at least before we've got a chance of stabilizing it. So, hey, get your running shoes on, everyone. We're going to have to run to keep ahead of this particular problem. So, last year was the hottest, but that's a headline you're going to see frequently.
Yeah, so when you say like that scares me off, right? It may probably, even in the air-conditioned environment, I might not be able to wear my full suit. Okay, right.
Well, one thing I do worry about is heat, which is one of the immediate impacts. Is, you know, in India last year and in Sichuan in China, we saw extensive days and weeks of 50 degrees Celsius heat. This is really hard to live in. You know, really hard to live in. People were dying in the street, really. And we need to be thinking about what our cities look like to be able to cope with that. You know, that means, on one hand, it means building regulations, you know, thicker walls to try and absorb it. It does mean air conditioning, but, you know, we can't afford to put 1,000 or 1 million air conditioning units on the sides of poor housing in Sri Lanka. because the houses aren't built for it, so the cool air just leaks like a sieve out anyway. And it's really energy intensive the way we're currently doing air conditioning. It'll crack the grid. And of course, what you don't want, if you've got an air conditioning unit, is the grid failing, because then no one has air conditioning until the grid can get up again. So this is a resilience question, right? So how do we design our cities to be different going forward? Be cooler.
Yeah.
Well, there are some clues. You know, Colombo does well. There's trees in lots of places. Green cities are 5 degrees cooler than non-green cities in terms of trees everywhere. That's one lesson. But building regulations, just, thicker walls, making sure that walls are covered by green stuff all the time, making sure we have proper insulation of the roof so it's not just a tin shelter. We need to be wealthier to do this. The poor can't do this, which means we've also got to have wealthier economies to be able to finance the transition to a world we can live in, to stop people dying in the street. And that's development, really. That's going to be inclusive development in Sri Lanka. Now, I realise this is possibly music in the ears of the government, but because Sri Lanka's been having a big economic crisis the last couple of years. But I'm really serious. I give this speech in development banks all the time. We need to understand development is not just a good in one sense. Development, inclusive development, which addresses the poor, is going to be critical for climate survival. If economies don't have the wherewithal to be able to do this stuff, they're going to implode, they're going to collapse, we're going to see Somalia everywhere.
Yeah.
And that's not good for the rich, because that's going to mean millions of people trying to cross the oceans to find a home. It's going to mean conflict, war, all that sort of stuff. And that's the world we're going into. These are some really hefty challenges.
Very true. Now, I saw some interesting posts, Sean, actually, on Climate Bond's LinkedIn page. So, how to finance the industrial transition in China?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And look, it's working. In fact, just a few weeks ago, just before the new year, the province of Hebei, which produces alone 12% of the world's steel, published a transition pathway for the steel industry. Yes. And it's all about shifting to electric arc furnaces and hydrogen generated steel. So this is where instead of using coal, you use hydrogen, green hydrogen, as the fuel to run blast furnaces, stuff, and a bunch of other things. They're working on it. And what we're absolutely trying to support them on is how we raise the right capital. Well, we've got global investors are keen. They understand they've got a risk to their portfolios. To take an investor in Sri Lanka, as we come out of the IMF tunnel, this is going to happen. We're going to be raising capital for things that Sri Lanka. People want to know that the investments are future fit, that they're not going to be at increased risk of default because of climate consideration. I mean, we've got enough other factors to worry about, but we want to get that one out of the way, which means, what does that mean? Well, it means you want an investment in a hotel where the hotel's going to keep operating despite crises. What does that mean? Well, they've got to be thinking about the efficiency of their heating, or their cooling, I should say, so the heat insulation. They've got to be thinking about, have they got solar on the rooftop because the grid fails, they can generate their own energy? These are resilience issues.
Yeah.
And this is going to become the norm in terms of investment. And that's what China's doing, really, just thinking about how to become future fit.
Yeah. So, wow. Okay. So, now biodiversity loss is obviously it's catastrophic, right? So, could you give us some example towards deforestation-free supply chains?
Yes, well, thanks for picking up on that. We're going to publish at the beginning of March now criteria for financing of food supply chain companies that can confirm no deforestation is involved in the supply chain. And that's really important because we're losing a lot of carbon from cutting the forest each year. But more importantly, from my perspective, we're losing biodiversity in spades. We're using the richest resource on the planet, and genetic complexity. So we've got to stop this. And so we're looking for as many ways as possible to provide credit plaudits for companies that are making sure that they're not inadvertently supporting biodiversity destruction in their supply chains, and hopefully an indicator of what you've got to do to be seen as positive going forward in the world of finance. So address this issue is really the message, right? So it's not complicated, but that is important. You know, we already have a lot of companies wanting to ensure this isn't the case, but unless you're interrogating your supply chain, you know, take an example in Brazil, some of the big meat packers do actively try and ensure that cattle comes from places that haven't been recently deforested, but there isn't a good tracking system. So a rancher in Mato Grosso that cut down forest last year can be selling his meat to a rancher next door who then sells it to the abattoir. These are problems. So we need some protocols and guidelines to try and avoid that happening. And that's what we're trying to do with our deforestation guidelines.
Yeah, wow, super interesting, right? So now building capacities to tackle climate-related risks and opportunities in India's financial sector. So what are your views on that?
So in India's financial sector?
Yeah.
We're doing quite a lot of work in India. We're currently working on a project which is involving regulators like the Reserve Bank of India and the Ministry of Finance on what they can do to promote green. And, you know, the Indian government is very focused on these sorts of issues. Really keen. They've been great. I mean, like everywhere, like in Sri Lanka, the question is, what can we actually do given the challenges we face, the constraints, the difficulties? And that applies in China as much as is in the US, as much as in India. And that's the conversation, the work we're doing at the moment. We're promoting issuance. That's a project among states, for example. We've had Maharashtra issue a green bond for renewable energy and so on. We've got 3 other states about to issue, including, I'm hoping, Tamil Nadu. We have the Reserve Bank of India looking at how to expose, disclose, assess climate risks in the portfolio of banks.
Wow.
And that's a financial stability issue, right? They're concerned that the rapid changes related to climate, and I'll come through those in a minute, are exposing those banks to increased risk that they're not necessarily tracking and managing well.
Yeah.
Now, if you're a regulator, you know, your prime job is to ensure financial stability. So you want all the people in that system to be across whatever risks are around and at least tracking, managing, and you don't want them like 2008 in the US. Suddenly discover they've got a risk that they've been ignoring.
Yeah.
So we're doing some work in that particular area. And just to give you a sense in climate, the 3 risks that are material in climate. The first one is the impact of climate change, which we talked about earlier. This is storms, floods. And so this is especially a problem for the insurance industry. So the insurance regulator is on top of this in most markets of the world. You know, in the US, I had a conversation with a senior government official last week where they're talking about the default risk amongst insurance providers in Florida.
Wow.
Because of the severe hurricanes because of climate change. The state of Florida, who doesn't believe in climate change, the government, has actually taken on the risk because all the commercial players have put up their prices so high that it's become possible. They said, no, we don't believe in climate. This isn't going to happen. So we're going to take on those. They set up a thing called the Citizens Reinsurance Corporation. So Mar-a-Lago, the Donald Trump's house by the water, or rather hotel by the water, as far as we know, is not insured or reinsured by private sector insurance because you can't get it because of flood risk. So a Republican climate change denying state has therefore said they'll take on the risk. This is crazy. This is not exactly market force. This is not exposing real risk. So the regulators have got to get on top of that. Well, so there's a climate impact risk because that's going to affect your portfolios. You know, big losses, you could send someone bankrupt one year. And including, by the way, big losses to companies you're lending to who are exposed. Think of someone who runs a car factory and they build a factory in by the coast in Colombia. where we're hopeful about car factories, right? But where they could be flooded by a severe storm surge. Now, because we know severe storm surges are going to become common, then that becomes a default risk for that car factory. So, and the central bank has to know about this sort of stuff. It has to know that the banks are tackling this. The second kind of risk is around changing government policy and changing corporate activity. So, we're in the middle now of a tsunami of change in the global economy. It's been hypercharged by the commitments of the major rich countries to 2050 and 2030 emissions reduction targets. Japan, the US, Europe, China for that matter. They're doing a lot. Now, that means change, right? So it means that things are going to be different. Instead, you say, what's going to be different? How do I know? Are we planning? We're talking about very rapid change. And if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, the GX program in Japan, there's a lot of subsidy going to these sort of changes. We've already seen changes. The reason why solar energy is so cheap in Sri Lanka now is because China, and before that Germany, have let out huge contracts every single year for the last 20 years for solar, and they've driven down the cost. Now, the cost has now become so low of production that actually nearly everywhere in the world, solar is cheaper than all other forms of energy. And it keeps going. China has just invested more this last year in renewable energy than ever before in history. It's vast. In fact, there's a report that's just come out in China which says that something like 40% of GDP growth last year in China was renewable energy and electric vehicles investment. That's clean energy. That's transition. Now, you sort of think, oh, God, that's changing everything, right? Well, of course it's changing everything. So electric vehicles is another one where in the last 3 months of last year, 42% of all cars sold in China were electric.
It's fantastic, yes, yeah.
And they're making it cheaper than everyone else. So in the next 3 years, petrol cars are going to disappear from the car showrooms of Colombo. I mean, we're going to get the grid right, don't get me wrong. So there's a dependency there. So there's the energy generation. But that's what's going to happen. And it's going to be chicken and egg, right? Because as people buy cheaper electric cars, there's going to be more demand and more revenue for electricity companies in supplying it. So these are changed. Now, if I'm a banker, a central bank, I'm thinking, what does this mean? Well, one thing it means, some companies are going to become more profitable. If somewhere in the world, like in Chile or in Australia, you're a lithium miner or a lithium processor, you're in the money. That's going to be a growth sector. Okay, so far so good. But who's going to lose out? Well, anyone who's producing oil at an expensive price is dead. Now, Aramco and Saudi make money for a long time because they're so cheap, the cost of production. But Alberta and Canada, they're now, I'm going to say, at a high likelihood of becoming assets to lose. Stranded assets is the terminology of the industry. Central bankers got to know about this because if they've got a bank like the Royal Bank of Canada that's highly exposed to Alberta tar sands, they've got they need to be thinking that some of their portfolio could go bust. If they're not, they're being negligent, and that's what we've got to start thinking about globally. So the world is changing fast. There are going to be new things that that are going to go under, and like car mechanics, mate. In 10 years' time, their world's going to be very different. They all have to become electricians. If they're not electricians dealing with batteries, electric vehicles, their business is going to go down the tube. But if they make the switch, to use a pun, they've got a chance of making success, and that applies to mineral resources. That applies to export of commodities. What are Sri Lanka's exports? Are there going to be changes in that export profile going forward? Probably. Do we know what they're going to be? No, because we haven't done the work. That's a risk. That's a big risk for the economy going forward. But it could be a huge opportunity. We may have the export potential here. But one thing I will tell you for certain is electricity generation is going to have to grow in Sri Lanka because we're in the process of electrifying our economies. So at the very minimum, anything which is cost-efficient electricity generation is likely to be a good bet. It's going to be solar. Gas is not so good for Sri Lanka because we're importing it. It messes up the current account deficit. We can't afford it. If we can do biofuels, if we can do renewable energy, then we avoid the current account deficit. So anyway, you get the idea. We're in the midst of this big tumultuous change. We have to start planning.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, very insightful, Sean. Very insightful. Right. So now, see, anytime soon, it seems like we might cross the 1.5 mark, right? So, do you think we can achieve net zero before 2035 or 40? Because some countries have put targets for 2050.
Look, net zero is a kind of a bit of artificial contract. Ideally, we would be net zero tomorrow morning if we listen to our scientists. So anything else is a compromise. But yes, I do think that the global target, official global target of net zero by 2050 is achievable. I think it's hard. I think it's tough. It has to be front loaded. We cannot be still trying to figure this out in the 2030s. We have to have done half the job by 2030. That is huge. That is massive. Now, it's not Sri Lanka's responsibility to save the planet because Sri Lanka is a trivial contributor to global emissions. But, it has a role in doing this. Sri Lanka is going to be one of the victims, if you like, going forward. But in terms of China, Europe, the US, India for that matter, yes, there are things we've got to do. We've got to act very quickly, but it is just doable. There's a project called the Inevitable Policy Response, which is a global modeling of what we can do and which we're part of. And it's done a very good job of showing that we have our best chance, in fact, our most likely scenario, they think, is warming will get to 1.8 degrees, probably about 2040, and then we will bring it down again with a wide range of measures we'll start using in the 2030s. Direct air capture, which is taking carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it underground. Sequestration, which is essentially soil-based, changing soil practices in agriculture, and reforestation. Sri Lanka is one of those places where we can reforest and so on. If we do all of these things, we sort of have a chance. The question is, how do we do them? Well, one of the things we need to do is we need to be able to pay landowners in Sri Lanka and in Sumatra and in Africa to reforest. In other words, you give enough money to say, just grow the forest, and if you do bioprospecting or something like that, that's fine, but get a canopy up there and give you enough money to do it, then now how do we do that? Well, that's going to be a carbon price scheme or something. We've got to sort out these things. We have a few short years to get the architecture right and get moving on it. I am optimistic, but not at all certain that we can get this done. I think we're in a very high risk position at the moment, but the nature of the human species is we keep working, right, on the basis that it might look high risk, but we're going to do it somehow.
Yeah, so from what you say, I mean, we need to push forward, and I mean, like, we need to look at saving our planet because we don't want anything bad to happen, right? So,
well, I mean, let's be clear. The planet will probably be okay. It's humans I worry about, and other species, because we're in the middle of a vast extinction event right now, generated by humans, where we are killing off the world's species, the world's biodiversity. So that's the risk. If we don't address climate change, I don't think we've got a very rosy future as a species. We will see large-scale loss of life. And I'm going to give you a very clear and simple prediction. If emissions keep rising at the rate they're rising now, we will lose a third to half of the world's population by 2100.
Wow, catastrophic.
Absolutely catastrophic. And I'm very certain about that. I can run through the areas if you like, but that's essentially the outcome, because that's what's happened before. We've been through periods of climate change, and generally it's associated with losing a third to half the world population. Now, they haven't been caused by humans. Well, actually, that's not quite true. We now think there's a reasonable hypothesis, nothing certain yet, that the climate change cooling of the 1600s was caused by humans, because Europeans unleashed measles and smallpox on South Americans in 1492 and onwards. We're now discovering civilizations in the Amazon through LiDAR, radar, that we didn't know were there. There's whole cities that disappeared as a result of germ warfare, really, but inadvertent to a certain degree, sometimes deliberate. We now think that like 95% of American Indians died in the 100 years after Columbus went to the Caribbean. Not a very good, it wasn't a very good discovery for American Indians. The regrowth in forestry was such that it sucked carbon out of the atmosphere. We now know from tree ring research, and cooled the planet. So much carbon we took out of the atmosphere. And in that cooling of the planet, we created what's called the global climate crisis of the 1600s. There's a famous book by a Cambridge historian about this. And how did we experience 2 degrees cooling? Apart from things like the Thames in London, where I live, freezing over for the first time in recorded history. We experienced it as war, as famine, and as pestilence, as pandemics. And we did lose a third of the world's population in the period 1600 to 1700, all around the world. So it's like, that's not that long ago. There's a real life history. That was only 2 degrees cooling, and we're now talking about 4 to 6 degrees warming. And so draw your own conclusions about the catastrophic risks we face. They're pretty severe.
Yeah, very well emphasized, Sean. Right. So, I mean, you gave a lot of insights. Okay. So, I mean,
but the mad thing is, Michael, we can do something about this.
Correct.
Like this lunacy, We now have got the science, we've got the technology, and we've got the money. We've got the money. We've got capital floating around the planet like we've never before in history. Sometimes, a lot of times, the wrong place. Like, it needs to be in Colombo building clean energy rather than in Japan and negative interest rate Japanese government bonds. But at least we've got the money.
Very true. Very true. Yeah. So, any final message, Sean, you would like to give all our viewers and listeners out there?
I think our message is that we do face very severe issues, but the world economy has started changing. Quite, the super tanker is moving, if I can use that phrase, and we need to understand the opportunities rising up. For economies, small economies, we've got to quickly shift mindset into thinking about how do we take advantage of these greening of the planet opportunities that are coming through. What's our role in doing this, while at the same time preparing our societies, our economies, for the impacts of climate change, which are going to be volatility, essentially, like weather volatility. So that's the challenge. We've got technology, we've got solutions. We do need to get those people and solutions in the room fast, because we've been ignoring them for a long time now. But it's time. It's time to plan and time to invent and imagine a changed world that will be future fit. That's really where we are this year and next year. Very short time frame window, because after that, we've got to be moving, we've got to be acting, we've got to be delivering the change that we need. The money's there, the investors are keen, and the green bond market, the market that you and I have spoken about in the past, we've got $4 trillion of bonds out there already, and we're going to get more and more. So the capital is there for the tapping. We just have to do the work to make it work. Get those bankers working harder. Stop them doing old-fashioned deals. Get them doing deals that are future fit. Get those corporations doing transition plans that will show the world, show what they can do and how they're going to change to become future fit. And get the city governments of Colombo to talk about what the vision for Colombo is that will be future fit, that will be resilient, that will also be inclusive. Because a bit of something we need to remember here, in a world of volatility, we don't have the luxury of letting the poor suffer, which is one of the terrible things we've done in societies in the past. Because if they're not bought in, they will see large-scale epochs. And if I was them, I would rebel, I would fight. There'll be social conflict and violence, the like. If we can find a path that is inclusive, that shares the wealth and shares the safety of resilience, we can move our society. And I think we will, through that, lay the foundations for the kind of wealth that we need to be resilient and to give a better future for our kids. And so I actually think that this turning point, this crisis that we're in, as part of this process, has the potential to lead to a much, much better world going forward. There'll still be challenges dealing with climate change, but you can't escape those now. But a more inclusive, a wealthier world, a world with the education that everyone needs to have to be able to manage these crises better going forward, and the technologies, the cities that will be clean and green and resilient. I'm excited, Michael. I think this is a really exciting moment in the history of the species of the planet, and I'm actually full of optimism and opportunity about it all. That's my parting words to the audience. Get excited. This is going to be an amazing ride.
Absolutely. So we need to stick together and fight to save our planet from future catastrophes caused by emissions. Great, Sean. So thank you very much for taking time and doing this podcast with us.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you so much for the work you're doing to get the message out.